Okay, let's get back to the PowerPoint here. There we go. Okay, so this idea of syncretism, this basically when you mash up two mythological traditions together, that is going to be extremely important here for thinking about all this. So someone like Plutarch, right, is a classic example of this syncretism and a sign that Greeks and Egyptians, well, especially Greeks because he's a Greek telling the story, but I think Egyptians too could do this kind of merging of ideas together. Um, and the thing about Isis, especially, is that she doesn't stop being important. After a certain point, she becomes even more important than Osiris in mythology because her story becomes this tradition that spreads across the world. Isis, first we have Isis and Serapis. So when the Greeks take over Egypt, they decide to kind of set up a new religion. This is all after Alexander the Great, by the way. This is his fault. They set up kind of a new religion of reinterpreting Isis and reinterpreting her partner Serapis. So for a while, they have a pair of gods, Isis and Serapis. And Isis is basically Isis plus Demeter, but also kind of Persephone. And of course, the classic Egyptian Isis stuff is still there. But then you also have Serapis, who is a very complicated fusion. He has Osiris, but he also has Hades in him. He's also kind of Zeus, but like a nice version of Zeus who like runs the afterlife. And he has this sort of cultic bull associated with him, which is sort of a prophet, a kind of tradition. So he's bringing in all these traditions together. And so if you ever see images of Hades where he has a basket on his head, that's not actually Hades technically, that is Serapis. And Serapis is much nicer than Hades. He'll take care of you. And it seems like the tradition around these gods is that they have secret rituals. And if you do the rituals right and you learn the secret rituals, they will give you a better afterlife. You will basically have an eternal good time, kind of go to a heaven of some sort, kind of like heaven. They don't use that word per se, but something really good in the afterlife if you worship the secret rituals of these gods. And Isis can protect you when you need protecting, and so can Serapis. And they watch over you, and they're nice and they're fun in a way that Zeus isn't necessarily nice, and Hades definitely isn't nice, and his world isn't really nice. But if you do these special rituals, you might have a nice afterlife. And if we think back to the very first day of class, I talked about there's a very similar thing with Demeter and a very similar thing with Dionysus. So these are called mystery religions where you have secret rituals that lead to happily ever after. And this idea, as you can imagine, becomes really, really popular and just spreads like wildfire. And as time goes on, in Greek times and Roman times, this Egyptian goddess becomes exported to the whole Roman Empire. In Roman times, Isis just basically leaves Serapis behind. Forget about that guy. Who cares about him? Isis is who's important. And Isis basically becomes such a fusion that she says, people begin to talk like all the other gods are just manifestations of this one goddess, Isis. They're just different versions. So that's syncretism taken to an extreme, seeing all the gods as one god. And Isis can basically do anything, and it's basically super powerful. There's a famous Roman novel, which is kind of a comedy novel. It's about a guy who gets turned into a donkey, an ass, because he's messing around with magic spells. And he goes on this whole adventure as an ass, but finally only gets transformed back into a human by praying to the goddess Isis. And the book has this wonderful passage near the end of the chapter that talks about this Roman version of Isis and this huge parade that's given in her honor. And we don't know how much this is like supposed to be a parody per se, because it is a comedy, and a lot of people are thinking, oh, maybe we should see it not so much as him just going off about how great Isis is, but more sort of him kind of parodying how wild and extravagant these Isis parades and Isis rituals are. But she does help him in a pretty straightforward way. And it is fun to see this great parade. There's all sorts of people in costumes, and they're doing all sorts of strange things, and they're cross-dressing, and they've got mirrors and lights and all sorts of stuff. And some of it probably, seems to resemble stuff that people do with festivals for saints and stuff like that. So Isis could even have an influence up to the modern day on, rituals for Mother Mary and stuff like that. But here she gives this great speech when she transforms what's his name, Lucius, back into a human. She says, "Behold, Lucius, moved by your prayer, I come to you. I, the natural mother of all life, the mistress of the elements, the first child of time, the supreme divinity, the queen of those in probably Hades, the first among those in probably the heavens, the uniform manifestation of all the gods and goddesses, I who govern by my nod the crests of light in the sky, the purifying wasps of the ocean, the lamentable silences of Hades, I whose single godhead is venerated all over the earth under manifold forms, varying rites, and changing names." So yeah, that's maximum syncretism right there. And this idea of this is something I've talked about in some of my other classes as well, that people might be needing or wanting gods who can take care of them in any situation, who have power over the whole universe, who are very loving and kind. That's a pretty powerful notion. And I think you see some traces of that going all the way back to the earliest appearances of Isis in Egyptian myth, that she's a caretaker, she's a maternal figure, and she is sort of able to give this power over life. So yeah, so we have the question here is, how much was this based on, how much is this coming from the Egyptian version of Isis? How much is this changing as you encounter new traditions? And the idea that Isis has power over the afterlife, we think that's something that was there in the original Egyptian context, but it probably grows as you encounter more and more religions, because there are a lot of gods of some kind of afterlife related thing. And it's interesting to think that maybe did the story of Isis and Osiris and Demeter and Persephone spring from a similar source? This idea of someone dies, but then there's a god who has the power to bring him back again. We can compare some other religious traditions, some other mythologies that have a very similar motif. So going back to the beginning of all this and saying maybe these different mythologies are connected. One figure is the goddess Inanna from the Mesopotamian or Sumerian tradition, which we're going to look at next time actually in a different way. Inanna is very fierce. She is very much a goddess of both love and war. So she's very destructive, but she's also very seductive. So she's associated with fertility through sexuality, and associated with lions and wild nature and things like that. And a very important part of her tradition is this sort of young, handsome young man that she marries, or handsome young god. And it's clear that she is definitely more powerful than him. She is very much more destructive and more of a warrior, but she kind of mellows out when she's around him. And this sacred marriage was an important part of her rituals, that priests and priestesses would at least talk up the marriage of Inanna to Dumuzi. And Dumuzi is associated with being a shepherd, taking care of animals. He's also associated with plants. He makes a tree grow, which is kind of a euphemism for something else growing. And so there's a lot going on here, associating him with nature and her with this sort of extreme level of power. And at one point, she does go to the afterlife. And in another story, she goes looking for him after he's dead. On the other hand, they have a more antagonistic relationship at sometimes. She finds him cheating on her and kills him, and then later regrets that he's dead. But the main reason she goes to the underworld is to meet with her sister, who is the queen of the dead. So that's interesting. It's almost like she's kind of reviving him, but almost not. It's kind of somewhere in between. But it's interesting that he dies, and he's young, he's handsome, he's beautiful, he's perfect. For another myth where you have a young man who dies, who's beautiful and handsome and perfect, there's the story of Cybele and Attis. Cybele kind of comes from near the Greek part of the world. We're not entirely sure exactly where, kind of from the east, but she becomes popular in Greece. And in some versions of the story, she is turned into Venus instead, or Aphrodite. But the story of her is that her beloved, handsome young man, Attis, dies, and then she mourns him. And there was a tradition in Athens of mourning Attis, or Adonis, by planting gardens on a rooftop. So you have these rooftop gardens, but the gardens would die in the sun because it's so hot. And then you would wail and lament. It was something that only the women of Athens did, would lament for the dead god of the plants. So there's a lot of interesting parallels here. So these are not examples of syncretism per se. Inanna and Cybele are not really syncretism. They're more things that are very similar, to the point where we wonder if there may be a connection if you go far enough back in time. We know a lot of different cultures are connected enough, are pretty connected in Europe. So one theory that was proposed was that there was originally a sort of dying and resurrecting god mythology, that there was this story of this god who is the consort of this powerful mother goddess, that the mother goddess is the one who's the most powerful. And then the god is young and handsome and vulnerable, and he dies. And then when he dies, she brings him back to life, and it goes in a cycle. And so this sort of cycle of life and death, this fit in with an idea that people had for a while, which was originally mother goddesses were much more powerful than gods. Nowadays, we're not so sure if any of that's true. It's stuff that goes far enough back that it would be really hard to prove. And people have pointed out there's a lot of differences between these different stories. So we don't want to get too caught up in similarities. But it's an interesting idea that maybe there was an original sort of goddess figure where the partner died, or like a daughter died, or somebody died. And then that turned into a tradition where different goddesses would bring someone back from the dead and have power over life and death. So maybe that's the origin of this if we go far enough back. Or alternatively, they evolved to kind of fill the same niche for the same reasons, because we notice that nature goes in cycles, goes through these periods of life and death. And so we see in nature these sort of coming and going, living and dying. And if there's any god that's going to have power over the afterlife, it's a god who has power over life itself and the sort of fertility that makes so many good things possible. So yeah, two possibilities, maybe a little bit of both. It's hard to say. But hopefully it's some interesting stuff to think about. And bringing that out of Isis and Osiris, you can kind of see them as maybe an example of that idea of life and death, fertility, goddesses and gods. And it's an interesting question, which of, Isis and Osiris, who's really in charge? Is Isis more powerful than Osiris? That's the question I want to discuss in our discussion question today. Haven't put it up yet. I'll put it up pretty soon. And I will meet you guys there to see who we think is more powerful, and to what extent you think goddesses are more powerful in Egyptian mythology. All right. Take care, and I'll see you in the discussion.